After almost 50 years in the Australian outback, the only British rocket to successfully launch a satellite into orbit has been returned home. The remains of the first stage of the Black Arrow were brought back to the UK as a symbolic gesture for educational outreach by the Edinburgh-based rocket developer Skyroarer. The company successfully completed an inaugural suborbital test flight from Scotland last year, and it's about to start testing a new upper stage orbital engine in Cornwall. The work's all part of a UK Space Agency plan to develop a vertical orbital launch complex at Sutherland. Black Arrow was a 3-stage launch vehicle developed in the 1960s and based on the earlier Black Knight rocket. Its first stage was powered by an 8-chambered rocket motor called Gamma 8, which was fueled by RP-1 kerosene and high-test hydrogen peroxide. A smaller 2-chambered version called the Gamma 2 was used for the second stage, while a single solid rocket motor was used for the third stage. Only 5 Black Arrows were ever built, with only 4 actually being launched, all from the Woomera rocket range in outback South Australia. The first launch in June 1969 was a suborbital test flight of the first 2 stages. However, the mission ended when the rocket's thrust vectoring system failed. The second launch in March 1970 was a successful suborbital test mission of the first and second stages. The third launch in September 1970 was intended to place the UK's first satellite, the Obra X2, into orbit. The mission, however, failed to reach orbit after the second stage shut down 13 seconds early. Obra was built using spare parts due to funding restrictions and was to have been used to measure upper atmosphere density by monitoring the decay of its orbit. The Black Arrow's fourth and final launch from Woomera in October 1971 was successful, carrying the Prospero X3 satellite into orbit. Prospero was designed to undertake a series of experiments to study the effects of the space environment on communications satellites, and it remained operational until 1973. The Black Arrow project was then suddenly retired after only the 4 launches in favour of using cheaper American Scout rockets. The 5th Black Arrow built was then placed on public display at the Science Museum in London, although a replica is on display at Rocket Park in Woomera. To find out more, Andrew Dunkley is speaking with astronomer Fred Watson.
The Black Arrow projectile. This is a really interesting little yarn.
Indeed, it is. It was more than a projectile. It was actually a launch vehicle. This was Britain's launch vehicle, developed during the 1960s. I remember when I was a lad, when I was leaving university and actually, thinking what I'd like to do with my career, because I absolutely wanted to be an astronomer, but there were other avenues that looked as though they might be related to that. And one of them was working for the company that was developing the Black Arrow, called Siddeley Dynamics. So when I was graduating from university and thinking about these things, it was very much on my horizon. Indeed, the Black Arrow project flourished between 1969 and 1971, of which the third flight was the first and actually only successful British orbital launch. I think it was Britain and a number of other countries as well, but Britain took the lead on that. So they actually put a satellite into orbit using the Black Arrow launch vehicle. And this really was the highlight of the Black Arrow program, because after that it was cancelled, presumably because of the sheer expense that's involved in developing these things. And by then there were competitors well established across the Atlantic from the United Kingdom. But that short life has given it, the Black Arrow rocket, a kind of almost legendary status. And I kind of feel that as well because of my nearly getting involved with it when I was just leaving uni. So where did it make its flight? Well, it was here in Australia. Even though the Black Arrow was built in the UK, it was launched from the Woomera launch facility in South Australia and basically put its satellite into orbit and then fell back to Earth and landed in the South Australian desert and has been there ever since until now, because this story is a rather nice sort of heritage type story involving I was going to say remnants. I think it's mostly in one piece, but it's very, very bent. Its various components have been seriously rearranged, the Black Arrow launch vehicle, but it has been brought back from Australia into the United Kingdom. And in fact, it is actually going, curiously, to a small town in Scotland where I used to live, a wee place by the name of Pennycook, not very far from Edinburgh. I lived in Pennycook for quite a number of years during the 1970s and 80s. So it's very nice to think that this piece of space history is going to be put on display, actually, in Pennycook.
All right. Now, the obvious question is why is it going to Pennycook?
Yes, I'm very, very glad you asked me that, Andrew.
I'm sure you would have told me without asking, but, I need to feel useful.
It's because the company that's paid to bring it back actually is a high-tech company based in Pennycook. Its name is Skyrora. I think they do basically space-based industry, and so it's fantastic that this rocket vehicle is coming back there. The other really interesting aspect of this, though, is that Scotland might, in a few years, have its own launching site, bearing in mind that in the 1960s and 70s, British rockets had to be launched from Australia. Things have changed to the extent now that in far northern Scotland, you could actually have a viable launch site, particularly for north-south launches. That's to say, spacecraft going into what we call polar orbits. You tend to need a fairly clear eastern horizon, if I can put it that way, preferably with ocean there for normal satellite launches. And you tend to want to be near the equator. Now, Scotland is not near the equator, but far northern Scotland will be a perfect location for polar launches, to put launches over the pole. And that is the usual kind of orbit that many military spacecraft are in, and also a lot of communication spacecraft too, such as the Iridium ones.
If they're going to start launching rockets from Scotland, they're going to have to really improve on their caber tossing, because seriously, that ain't going to do it.
Well, that's probably who they'll get to do it. Always, hey, we can throw a beam of wood, so we can launch a rocket.
Yeah. Maybe. It actually reminds me, and I'm glad they found it, and I'm glad they decided not to leave it in the middle of the desert rotting away and letting the vandals get to it, because I know they had a couple of cracks at it. But it reminds me of Australia's first attempt at a launch vehicle, which turned out to be a leftover American rocket.
It was, that's right.
Which we painted over with a kangaroo, and we launched it. And it came back down to earth, and the paint half burnt off and revealed the American flag or the letters USA or something. And they shoved it in a chook pen. And it's still there to this day.
What else do you do with one of these?
We're so classy in this country.
It launched, if I remember rightly, was it RESAT? WRESAT?
Something like that, yeah.
Yep, Weapons Research Establishment satellite. Yeah, very interesting stuff. Well, there you go. So what delights me, Andrew, about this is that the space age has its own history, and I've seen most of it as well. I certainly remember the first
I didn't mean to laugh, Fred.
No, it's true. And it's great to be able to see at first hand this progression of the technology from these first attempts like the Black Arrow and things of that sort to what we see now with SpaceX sending launch vehicles back up and landing them back on Earth on their tails and things of that sort. It's brilliant stuff.
At least the English one had a good name.
It's about all it had.
Yeah. But it is fascinating history, and I'm glad it's found a new home. It certainly beats being put in a chain mesh fence enclosure.
With chooks.